So Courtney is a semi-professional vocalist and voice teacher, as well as a music tech and an HCI researcher. And she completed an absolutely stonking, deep-reaching PhD at the Augmented Instruments Lab. References alone 47 pages, but I can really recommend having a look at that PhD. Absolute belter. It centers on better understanding what vocalists do, not just objectively, but subjectively, through a whole mixture of approaches, micro-phenomenology, embodiment, biosignals, and this wonderful thing of auditory imagery. And in fact, the insights from thinking about voice seem to go really deep. She had a lovely CHIME paper on rethinking metaphors in HCI generally, based on how music teachers get singers to sing better. She had a stream of publications, TIE, CHI, Music I, CM TIE, however you pronounce it. She's worked in more amazing research labs than most people shake a stick at: Berkeley, QMUL, postdocs at Max Planck, King's. And she's currently a lecturer at the research-only Loughborough University, London. But of course, she's going to be talking about something completely different. So over to Courtney.
Oh, thanks. That's such a really nice introduction. And yes, I'm really looking forward to talking about a particular vein of research I've gotten really interested in, and one that's maybe a little bit unhinged compared to some of the things I've been working on lately. So let me just pull up my slides. Okay, but if I do that, I don't know. Sorry, you'd think after many years of doing Zoom stuff I would have figured this out, but apparently not. Let's see if I share here first. Okay.
Yep.
Oh, I can't view my notes while I present. That's all right. We'll just see if I can remember my own presentation. Okay, anyway, so yeah, so a little bit of a kind of tangent from some of the research that Simon was talking about. What I'll talk about a bit today is some of my work that I've been working on. So I previously did a postdoc at the Max Planck Institute for Informatics in Saarbrücken in Germany. And this is a kind of ongoing project and themes of research that I've been looking at with my colleagues there. And I'll try to talk a little bit more about voice stuff specifically, especially at the end. But yeah, just looking a little bit, especially at the body in music performance as the theme of this particular seminar goes. So this is me working in this little musical ensemble here, along with some really lovely people here. So Paul's playing bass and Valentin's working his drum machine, and then Rachel, who I believe is in this call, she's sort of behind the screen taking this picture. And she's our lovely costume designer for this Rave network that we've built, which is a series of wearables looking at connections and networks between musicians during collaborative performance, and especially during improv. So just to kind of see everybody's faces now that we are, not totally blurry and hidden behind all of the gear. So this is a work that's kind of ongoing in a few different institutions at this point, but all sort of converging within the sensory motor interaction group at the MPI Informatics. So if you don't recognize already, that's me. So yeah, I'm working as a lecturer now at Loughborough University, London, in Stratford. So university with two city names in the title. I'm in London, but yeah, working for the lovely Loughborough University. And yeah, so this is sort of my background. If you don't know me, this is the Brahms a couple years ago. I'm somewhere in the sort of middle in one of the back rows. So I'm coming from a really very traditional, if you will, vocal background, as doing lots of choral singing. When I was at Berklee College of Music, I trained in classical vocal styles. So I studied Baroque and Romantic opera, and then also did a bit of jazz study as you do at Berklee. But this is sort of the realm in which I originate. And then now I sort of do stuff like this. This is my little setup here, performing with some sonified EMG. I got my little laptop, and that's sort of it. I also do stuff like this. This is a weird gig I did a couple of years ago in a boat in Germany, in Saarbrücken, while I was working at the MPI. So we have lots of tech kind of strewn about and lots of really variable things happening. So a lot more improvisatory things happening that, maybe a little bit contradictory to the choral aspects, or so one might think. I'm really, really interested in the voice. So I, during my PhD, started working on projects like this. This is the singing knit. It was presented at Augmented Humans in 2022. I collaborated with very lovely Sophie Skatch on designing this knit collar for vocal EMG. And so we've worked with biosignals related to the voice. So the little knit pads in the collar, the little conductive traces, they match up with laryngeal muscles on the neck and in the throat. And so we can get different aspects of movement in the voice during performance. And so working to get everything into a wearable format. What does that actually look like in performance? How do we get this tech, which is designed for a really medical kind of application, get it into the hands of performers? This is some of the things we were looking at there. And then this is from last weekend. So in Sheffield on Saturday, amazing Lou Barnell, who's a really great vocalist working out of Sheffield, she performed this installation sound work called To Fly Out in the Heat of Day. And this used some of that vocal EMG design that I had done during my PhD. So we made a little adaptation of the little Vox EMG boards. So these are really meant for doing laryngeal EMG, but can be extended to other parts of the body. So Lou is taking movements off of her muscles and using it to, off of her shoulder muscles and using it to activate loopers and to run different effects on her voice while she performed. And it was all embedded in this massive sculpture. So really getting into kind of wearables and how people actually interact with technology in performance. And that's all kind of stemming from this realm of my PhD of having worked with electromyography and looking at the really subtle ways that the body moves, especially places where we're not really aware of it. When our muscles are moving underneath the surface, we don't really think about them. Even for non-singers, you could think, well, what is it like to speak? What does that feel like? Do we really have a huge awareness of that? Not so much. We do have that sensory motor feedback we get. We do have that auditory feedback we get about our voice, but it's all very kind of subtle, and especially to other people, it's not really well known. By the way, I'll share this around after, but if anybody's interested in EMG or its messiness or the nonsense of working with EMG, please get in touch with me afterwards. I'd love to chat with you. But all the schematics and everything are available on my GitHub there. So I started getting really, really interested in this idea of liminal spaces. So that idea of where are these spaces between the body, between technology, between people in performance? We have all these different tiny facets of interaction that are occurring that we don't really even think about. So we can use this idea of liminal spaces, and if you don't know what a liminal space is, it's sort of this transition, or maybe a hallway. It's my little door on the side here. Liminal spaces are kind of these transition points where you're neither one thing, you're not really the other thing either. You're somewhere in between. It's a bit nebulous, but interconnected. And as performers go, we all know that this is a massive part of performance, especially working with technology and especially working with other people. There are lots of elements of control and lots of elements of cooperation that aren't necessarily happening in any one given place at time. There's lots of interactions that go on that are very subtle and sometimes hard to notice. And so one of the things that we've been trying to do at the Max Planck Institute and looking at this idea of these connections or these networks that occur between musicians, that occur between instruments, and occur especially between bodies in performance and the way that we understand each other. How we can shift those awarenesses and shift those roles around, and then look at how that actually impacts the performance, maybe leads to new creative applications, and also can just be really fun and kind of silly as well. So for instance, we have this very lovely diagram of that particular ensemble that I mentioned at the beginning. So again, Paul on the left, Valentina on the right, and I'm in the middle here. And we have lots of different aspects that are going on in this network. So, between all the equipment, and there is a lot when we get together, there's often a lot of equipment that gets put on the table that doesn't even get used. So there's a lot of things going on when we get into this improv setting. We have different effects, we have different sensors that are happening, we have lots of each of our own kit. So I work with a looper usually, and Paul's working with a massive pedal board, Valentine's got a drum machine and a sampler, we have all the mixer and all the speakers and everything. So there's lots and lots of tech going on. And then above the surface, in this kind of yellow depiction here, we also have these networks that are a little bit more invisible but exist between us. We have eye contact and subtle gestures and nods and body positions. There's also a lot of subtle language that goes along with it, unspoken commands. We're probably most of us aware of these things in our own performance. And then there's also this nice element of trust, especially when you're working in an improvisatory setting. There's no written score. We're all sort of working as we go. So the way that our ensemble typically works is that we just get into a room, somebody will start with a melody or with a beat or something like this, and it just evolves over time. So we also have to have a bit of trust in each other to be able to carve space for ourselves, to be able to follow and to lead at given points. And this is something that takes time and builds over lots and lots of work. It's not something you can just throw people into a room together and this will be really well knit. But over time, all of our actions, interactions, and the way that we move and play, we start to know each other, we start to learn each other, and this network forms out of this embodiment and out of a lot of the entanglement between all these pieces of tech, between our bodies, and between our relationships with each other. So what we've been trying to do is look at a way to extend and then to make these connections really, really well known. And we're especially interested in working with the body, and especially these physiological aspects that might be a little bit more subtle, might be a little bit less well known to each other, given that we're all working from a kind of different disciplines, different instrument techniques, that kind of stuff. So we have a series of nodes. These are sort of points in the network where we're investigating particular things. So we've used the word nodes here, but these are basically 3 wearable controllers that we've used and designed. Like I mentioned, I think Rachel's here somewhere, so hopefully she can give a little bit of dialogue at the end. But really designed to be very bespoke for this particular network, and looking at different physiological movements or different activities that occur during playing. So we have, for me, for the voice, we have this corset called Bones. We have a cap for Valentine working on the drum machine called Veins. And then we have for Paul playing bass, a glove, which we've called Tendons. The names are not arbitrary, going along with connective networks in the body. The names come from, of course, connective networks. So going into these a little bit further. So the corset, which I'll talk a little bit about more at the end in terms of my singing practice with it. Also, if this looks familiar to anybody from a NIME paper, please get in touch with me and I will reassign you to something else. But hopefully not. I won't be unanonymizing myself here. But Bones was basically created to look at some of this shape-changing capacity of the abdomen while singing. And so if you've ever had a singing lesson, you'll know that the encouragement of diaphragmatic breathing is massively important. And this means that the body has to change shape. When we really breathe deeply and allow lots of space and get the support we need from the muscles to control the rate of breath, we have a lot of expansion and movement in the abdomen, especially around the belly and sometimes in the back. So what Rachel and I had designed here was this corset, which is actually a sort of anti-corset. It doesn't really hold anything in like a corset would do, but rather stretches to allow movement within the abdomen. Sort of an additional measurement for the breath, which kind of draws on some other similar corset projects like the Body Electric and Corsetto from Kelsey Cotton and Ozgun Afsar, if I can remember. That's probably the biggest influence we've had here. But rather than having some kind of a stretch sensing, what we've done is use the shearing sensor. So as the body moves, 2 pieces of conductive fabric pull apart and stretch, and we can measure the actual expansion of the body that way. So here we have the kind of design process going through this. And basically the process is something that evolves over time as we work with the body. So we have different versions of this. For instance, figure B, this is a toile. So this is the sort of initial physical form of the garment. We use this to kind of fit this on the body and look at where it actually sits. It's just easy to sketch out and take measurements, but once you actually put something on a body, that really, really determines what it's actually going to be able to be capable of in use. You can't really determine all of the ways that a wearable will act, especially a sensing garment, until it gets onto a physical body. And then there have been lots and lots of iterations on this over time, and I'll talk about that a bit more, but essentially trying to give way and let the body itself lead this sort of expansion. So not trying to hold anything or maximize the kind of stretching sensing, but to really play around where there's the most movement on the body naturally, and what kinds of things kind of pop up as we go along. So this is the corset in its final form. As performed. So we recently presented a lot of these, or not a lot of these, all of these garments at TEI a couple of weeks ago, performance. So here's our sort of final look or final in process up on the upper right there. And so lots and lots of fittings, lots and lots of paying attention to the body and letting the body kind of guide the design of these garments. Just to show a little bit of what this stretch sensing looked like. I'll show it here for this particular wearable just because the other ones I think are a bit more over. It's a bit hard to see what's happening here in the videos. So the shearing sensor, as you breathe, you have these layers of fabric that pull apart, and we can measure the capacitance between them to see how much changing is happening in the abdomen shape. Okay, so moving swiftly along. The next garment that we looked at, so our next node is, again, with bass playing. So this is the glove tendons, and keeping on the theme of a lot of what Paul was doing with all of the kit that he typically uses, and all of the kind of switch actions, lots of pedal boards, lots of other little modular synths in the work. I wanted to have a garment that was really responsive to different kinds of modal input. So there's different sensors like galvanic skin response, heart rate sensors, and then there are also these little buttons on the side of the thumb and forefinger here, so they can also be used typically like other switches in this loop. So kind of honoring the technology that's already built in addition to the body itself. So again, designed over lots and lots of different iterations. We actually had to do a bit of a kind of last minute hack right before TEI because Paul inconveniently broke his hand right before we had to do this performance. So changing and honoring to the body sometimes can be a little bit haphazard and done out of necessity, but it's good to have that knowledge of where's the interaction really coming from, so changes could be made. So looking at what this kind of looks like in iteration, the right side is the final form of this particular node. So looking at and aligning with a lot of the ways in which bass is typically played, there's a lot of these biosignals which we can measure sort of passively, but then there's also this active amount of control that comes off of the switches on the fingers too. And then finally, the last wearable that we had done is veins. So this was the sort of cap for Valentin as our, I think he likes the term drum machinist or machinist or something. I'm not sure exactly what you call somebody who operates a drum machine operator. But he really wanted to play on these ideas of the kind of rave culture and the almost anonymous state of a lot of really heavily electronic musicians, the kind of hidden face, really kind of low-key, wanting to kind of obscure some of the things about the self. And this also goes on with a lot of Valentin being someone who normally performs by himself, so working in a lot of solo contexts or in a lot of contexts where he's not usually within a network. So having some of that kind of anonymous state preserved in our group interaction. So this wearable cap has an EMG setup as well, taken off of the facial muscles, and then working it into this kind of a cap setup where there's not total obscurement of the face, but still that kind of anonymous status. If you put up a hoodie, we can recreate some of these sort of typical kind of rave looks within this network. And so looking at the kind of final setup and in use here, we have the electrodes on the side of the cheeks there. So as Valentin has these subtle kind of facial movements, he's not really overtly doing very much, but he has a lot of focus and concentration. We can pick up on some of these really, really subtle movements. So yeah, just a couple ways of showing some of these sort of body-led, kind of observing what we do in our own individual practices or what parts are really important to us, and then designing these wearables around that. Everything made really kind of bespoke to the wants and wishes of each of us as performers. So I won't go too much into detail about this, but basically all of these nodes work in a very similar way. So we have this kind of a sensor setup. Each of them has a different kind of sensing mechanism, but we're turning everything into control voltage, so we can really easily plug and play into different modular synths or into a lot of Eurorack formats. So we tried to keep things really very consistent with how we're almost injecting this technology into the network. We're wanting to, again, honor all of those connections that already exist, but be able to go forth and try to overextend or try to really make some of these very, very subtle movements. We're talking about slight movements of the jaw or little bits of breathing or very, very small hand movements that in a collaborative performance we are not necessarily paying attention to so much. And so really bringing these things out, yet working within the existing network and all the equipment that we already use. And so this is our sort of typical setup, even complete with I realized earlier there's a little kind of food dish in the front here, so typical electronic musicians with stuff all over the table. But this is the kind of network that we physically see here. And the way that we've incorporated these nodes into it, we have these, where there's not already an existing modular synth like Paul's on the left here, we have these little boxes that Valentin designs, these tiny little modules, where we basically have all of those sensors are able to be plugged in and then used as as control voltages to manipulate other aspects of the network. So we can do a lot of work with self-modulation. So the biosignals that we're taking can be used to control something in our own performance, or we can start to modulate each other's performance. So this allows us to explore different aspects of how our body movements and how our practice comes into play in this network, or also kind of subverts the network. Usually we're not directly, grabbing somebody's sound and doing something with it, but with these kinds of interactions we can. So yeah, some of the things we're looking at are, like I said, what are the existing networks here? As we start to disrupt them with the addition of these signals, we start to see some of the almost intact things that normally exist between us. And then also looking at how we can extend each other's performance. So yeah, what's the best way to do that? It's actually just playing together. So we've been working with these pieces of equipment for, I don't know, maybe a little bit over a year now. So spending lots of time together and actually just seeing what this equipment does within our typical kind of improv setups. Normally we wouldn't be using these biosignals like this, but adding a lot of these components in really changes what we've already had going on. So we have established relationships, and now we're seeing what happens as we add in these new presences of our bodies and the kind of conversations that emerge around them. And just to give a little kind of clip of, hoping I've shared my sound here, but just a little clip of what this sort of sounds like when we do a performance together. Oops, sorry.
Earthquakes like a firefly. Stand by. Earthquakes like a firefly. Stand by.
And really hilariously, I have no idea where the original video of this is. This was the supplemental material for the TEI submission, which is why everybody's faces are all blurred. I have no idea where the original video is gone, so that's all we're left with. It's very artsy. But some of the things going on there, if you notice, I can go back and kind of play a little bit of a still here. So we have Paul kind of on the left, who is meant to be playing bass, and he's doing this kind of thing with his hand, so not very much playing bass. We have me, and I'm in the middle, moving a lot, especially for somebody who's wearing a corset that's sort of meant to be measuring my my abdomen. And Valentin was very, very subtle. So there's a lot of different things going on here now that we've introduced these wearables into performance. There's vocal filtering that's going on. So in this case, Paul's hand movement is manipulating that. And the expansion of the corset, I'm controlling a filter on Valentin, and Valentin's facial movements, he's modulating himself in this case, so applying some more filtering and distortion that you can hear in this crackling onto the drum machine. So we've added all of these additional networks in here, and we see some really bizarre behaviors start to emerge. Let's carry on. Really won't let me play the whole video, will it? Okay, so for instance, in this next clip, it's basically just me and Valentin playing around here, and you can see he's actually taken the electrodes off of his face because we started focusing on one particular aspect of this, which is that the expansion of my corset is controlling some of the filter cutoff on his drum machine. So we're really, really focusing on this one particular aspect of the network. And it's starting to get a little bit crazy because I'm moving around quite a lot, which as a classical vocalist is not something I really am trained to do. In fact, you're more trained out of moving this much in performance. But actually the movement and shape of the body really shaping the performance in this particular way starts to lend to these really interesting combinations of how our bodies kind of physically manipulate each other in performance, and getting that kind of groove or that sort of rave feeling of really being engaged with the body to the point of not realizing you're doing it. So yeah, again, like working with all of these different kinds of filtering and feeling the body in these different ways, we become really, really hyper aware to how each other is moving. We also start to get into some really funny conversations. For instance, this particular image or video here sort of follows a conversation that I was having, where I was getting a little bit frustrated about not being able to control things the way I wanted, and had to explain that, I don't breathe at the same time that I sing. So if we're controlling different aspects of the voice, we need to do something in order to make it so that way the control that happens with the breath lasts a bit longer. And it's kind of funny the way that we sort of start to understand each other's bodies a bit more. Valentin, who's not a singer, well, you'll see, he sort of very playfully pokes around with the corset, and you'll be able to hear that the stretching or the conduction between those two sliding sensors, the shearing sensors we've made, they do alter the voice, but it's really difficult to hear until we add some delay in here.
You just like make a steady noise. And then we'll continue, sorry.
He's literally poking me, so we get some filtering. Trying to understand what's actually happening here on someone else's body. And then if we go a bit further in, we've added some delay, so that way the signal actually comes slightly later when I've started to resume singing a bit, so we can actually hear it whilst I'm doing something. And this is in self-modulation. And so on. So trying to figure out ways of incorporating the body and its movement into a lot of these different aspects. We also get some really bizarre things like Valentin chewing his beat. Which of course is not a really intended behavior coming off of this, but something that we sort of find in the moment. We can do very sort of dramatic things, really dramatic movements. Just for the sake of time, I'll skip this video, but maybe I can show it at the end. So looking at some of the ways that we've been studying these interactions within our musical network and how technology kind of plays in. So we're looking a bit at sort of a reflective and then also a pre-reflective side. And I'm really interested in applying micro-phenomenology to studying some of the connections and some of these really kind of challenging paradigms that come up from having lots of really bizarre connections added into an existing musical framework. So if you're not familiar with micro-phenomenology, I'd be really happy to answer some questions about it afterwards. But just to give a kind of really basic idea, most of the kind of interview data collection or sort of gathering of accounts that we would get from working in these contexts is reflective. We have something happen and then we talk about it afterwards, so we're looking back on it. And what microphenomenology really strives to do is it uses an interview practice that goes into the moment to re-evoke an experience and to walk through it step by step in a pre-reflective way. So rather than trying to kind of rationalize or justify anything, we actually just go through and kind of re-evoke all of those feelings and get them in the moment. And so some of the really big things we've been noticing coming out of these really bizarre networks and the disruptions that we've had are ideas of insecurity and being noticed in one's musical network, how we dictate each other's presence and the different roles that we take in collaborative performance, how space is made and what happens when we push really hard to make space for ourselves, and then also adapting and abandoning plans that we had. So this idea of insecurity and being noticed, we're working as a group in very, very regular context, but there is this idea that we don't really know too much about each other's instruments. Explaining to somebody else that I don't breathe at the same time that I sing is not really a conversation that I thought I would have to have, but we don't really know exactly everything that goes on within our network. So we have these ideas of overt versus covert. For instance, Valentin and I doing very subtle movements had a really big feeling about Paul having this glove where he could really very visually move his hand. And so this creates tension around feeling very heard or feeling like you have presence in a group, and then shows us there are a lot of dynamic roles that need to be negotiated. And this is something that we do in the music performance itself, but can sometimes be a bit subvert and maybe not always answered. When we really highlight the way that people kind of take over or control each other's sounds, we really start to feel these ideas of being noticed. And to that end, we also have these ideas of how do we actually decide roles, especially in improv, when we're not really verbally saying, oh, okay, you'll do this and you'll do this. What are some of these really subtle things that happen so we can decide to give space for other people? And do we really know what other people are doing? There are a lot of these other more than human things that kind of add up to this performance as well. There are a lot of body movements that we don't really have control over. The breath, for instance, is a really good idea because we can control our breath, but we also you know, it happens automatically if we're not controlling it. So there are a lot of different things that happen beyond what we just experience. When we don't have space, we can often have these sort of unhealthy techniques come up. For instance, this crazy chewing of the beat that Valentine did at the end is really, really fun to try to get some bizarre control over the network, but you might end up then getting a sore jaw at the end. But we do have these sort of needs to feel present and be heard within the musical collaboration we have. And then providing this body-based control sort of runs a risk as well of acknowledging that we as people might push ourselves to try to make ourselves heard or be part of that network. And then finally, we have this idea of adapting or abandoning plans. So like I said before, Paul moving his hand around and not really doing much bass playing. You know, this is a way of creating space for interaction and presence within the group, but sort of subverts the original intentions of the device. So when we actually put these devices into the hands of people, how are they actually used? And in these senses, we might have controllers wearing us, where they dictate our actions and we don't really get to have too much of our own say if we feel that we're very limited. So yeah, just to kind of take a little bit of last minute time here. I think I have like a minute left or something, right? Great. One other thing I've really gotten interested in, which I hope will segue us nicely into the next talk. Not only do we have all of these different aspects presenting with respect to our network, we also have bodies that change and do weird things over time. So if you sing at all, you probably realize your body is changing all the time. Maybe even if you don't sing, this is sort of a, you know, sometimes you wake up in the morning and you just feel really, really bad and your body's not going to cooperate with you that day. So in the design of our vocal corset here, we've had to do several iterations of it because of just physical changes in my body. I had a lot of weight fluctuations. And so we start to see not only do we each have all of our own aspects of control within a musical network, but our bodies are doing things that we don't really have control over. And so what Rachel and I tried to do is take this almost, we've been calling it body lutherie. So taking the idea of the body as leading the design of musical instruments. How does the body's shape change really interact with the corset, with other garments that we design? How can we be a bit more sympathetic to changes in the body without, you know, trying to fit it into particular contexts or being frustrated at it? How can we allow more space to it? So future versions of the corset, especially, we're looking at how to kind of negotiate all of these different changes that happen over really small time scales, you know, just from day-to-day living, and then also larger time scales of changes in the body. So yeah, lots of different iterations of this, and these are definitely not, you know, final projects. They'll continue to adapt over time and change as we do. So yeah, that kind of brings me to the end, and what's next, looking at the body's role in interaction and looking more into this idea of body-led design, wanting to take a bit more of this idea of long-term experiences, especially from a pre-reflective standpoint, seeing how all of these feelings of uncertainty or feeling not really listened to, or feelings of I really have a lot of space and I feel like I can be really contributing to this interaction in this network. How do these things change over time as we learn more about each other's movements, about each other's bodies? And then how does this sort of change the way that we perform together as a group? And then finally, looking at ways to expand the network. There are lots and lots of other things that play into musical interaction, especially when we get back into the idea of rave culture. Lots and lots of things based off of audience participation, off of the feelings in a room. So, you know, looking at other points, other nodes that we can take advantage of in these networks to further connect or disrupt, and then really learn about how these things are all working together in performance. So that's all from me. If you're interested in these papers, so I have the RaveNET publication from TEI, which was published a couple of weeks ago, and then also a link to the micro-phenomenology paper here. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that as well, and how we'll be using that throughout the further study of this, but check out that 9 paper as well if you're interested in that. And then, yeah, feel free to connect with me at any one of these given channels. I'd be happy to talk more about wearables and performance, or EMG, or other biosignals, or anything voice related. Please feel free to get in touch. So thank you. Everybody's muted, but I can see your little hands moving. Great, Andrea. I like the emoji as well.
And so please either use the chat or put up your hands for questions as you like.
Can see the chat as well. Great.
Or if you're feeling really bold, just go right ahead with the microphone. If there aren't other hands up. Oh, ask to unmute. Well, okay, so just while people are thinking, maybe, so can you tell us a bit more about the balance between just feeling your way through it, just doing it and seeing what happens, and influences like the micro-phenomenology and all the many other theoretical things.
Yeah. So the way that we've been kind of the way that we've been approaching a lot of this stuff is really kind of discovery based at this point. So of course, not really being able to see what arises until we get these instruments into the normal creative environment that we have, and seeing what things start to change. This is how we start to pull some of these ideas out. Before in a maybe ensemble setting, you might have that feeling of like, oh man, I really wanted to take over the melody there. I had a really cool thing I was going to do, and somebody else jumped on it too quickly, and I didn't get to. And then that moment passes. But being able to look at our movements and the way that we take up space in this network really starts to pull some of these ideas out. So once we have these threads of, how do we occupy different roles, or how do we make it known that we want to occupy different roles, or how do we actually create space for ourselves when we aren't being listened to, that kind of stuff. That's when we start to get into a bit more of the pre-reflective state. So we have the experimentation gives a lot of reflective kind of qualities. We can talk with each other and record different interviews, especially in a lot of the design stage. We've been spending a lot of time looking at, oh, well, the last time I performed with this, I felt, this, and I want this to change about the corset. No, I didn't feel like it worked the way I wanted it to. We can always adapt in the past. What the micro-phenomenological aspects of it do are to really go back into particular moments. So we can isolate a point in time where, maybe, for instance, from my experience, had a lot of difficulty sometimes with the breathing because the voice is so subtle. There's not a lot of very visible movement from the breath, and it doesn't really happen whilst I sing. So it's often disconnected from the way that I externalize my practice. So we can take a particular moment like that and really isolate it. And then what micro-phenomenology does is to really take that moment and slow it down. A lot of the sensory experiences that we have happen really, really quickly, and then we're just sort of kind of rationalizing them at the end. So what we do in a micro-phenomenological interview is we actually go back to the moment and outline its structure. So we start at the beginning and go all the way to the end in a really diachronic way, looking at individual steps as that moment unfolds. And then we look at really, really subtle kind of sensory aspects in the middle. So for instance, how does it feel to not have that kind of presence? Is it a tension in the body that we get? Where is that tension located? So for instance, some of the reflection might reveal things like, I felt a bit uneasy, or I felt not noticed. But the kind of pre-reflective dimensions, you'll get sensations of, really feeling kind of tight, really feeling things are pushed too hard, really feeling some of the more sensory aspects of the disappointment as well. Where does that kind of feel in the chest, or how does that worry kind of manifest? And you get a bit of a more nuanced feeling of that, especially as it changes over time and those, feelings evolve.
Well, I think there's going to be lots of cross-cutting issues between the two talks. There's going to be plenty of opportunity to ask wider questions afterwards. So maybe if I hand over to Tom now, and maybe if we... Oh, hang on, wait, no, we have got a question. Hooray, in the chat.
Yes, I can answer this one as well about micro-phenomenology. So during the interview phase, you don't need to enact the experience again. So the process of doing the micro-phenomenological interview is quite, what's the right word here? It's really meant to be quite adaptive, and there's a lot of training that goes into learning how to do this. But essentially what you do is you have the participant, whoever you're interviewing, re-evoke that experience. They might have just done it and then you're talking with them afterwards, or maybe they did it a week ago or a month ago or something like that. It doesn't necessarily matter, because you're not going to be able to recreate the original experience. What you want to do in the interview is basically to get them to return to that state of sensory understanding and to re-evoke that experience. So you start very, very at the beginning and really, really hone into some of these sensory dimensions. Usually you start with things like, if you imagine what that moment was like and you're in that moment now, where is your body? Where are you facing? What position are you in? So you really try to get somebody to revisit that moment of experience and then step through it. It doesn't actually need to happen again.
So let's maybe just fit one in from Steve there.
Hiya. Hi, that was really fascinating. Thanks, Courtney. You're talking very much about the its form as claiming spaces, and which is very much looking at the, for me, you acting upon the other musicians. Fascinating. Could you reflect a bit on the agency from the other side and how you negotiated that?
Being acted upon.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's two ways, isn't it?
Yeah, so I was worried a little bit about time, but maybe I can show a teeny little bit of this clip of me modulating Paul. So what sort of happens in this moment is he's playing and all I'm doing is breathing and singing a long sustained note. And so the filtering changes on his guitar as he plays. You get this sort of like woo, woo sort of sound on the guitar, and that's me breathing actually. And we had a conversation about this particular aspect of modulating each other, which was really centered around not so much like a loss of agency, because we're not really changing the core components of that. You know, I'm not changing anything about the riff that he's playing or any of the patterns that he's kind of outlining there, but I am changing his sort of end sound. He gets to pick the filter that he puts on, and then I activate it, which is a bit unsettling because it happens in a way that you don't have any control over. So you do lose agency in that sense. But the way that he kind of described it was that it ended up being more adaptive. So it was like having another bit of collaboration in his playing, as if I were over there turning the knob, but he can't see me doing it. So he has to really pay attention to what I'm doing. And this is how we get some of these, you know, we're sort of relinquishing control. And the benefit of doing that is that we get to understand a bit more about how that person's body is working, because he's literally feeling and listening to my breath and then having to respond to it, which is not necessarily something that would happen in a regular performance. So yeah, definitely loss of agency and control in some aspects, but the trade is that you then understand a bit more about what somebody's body is doing as they perform with you, which is very, very interesting to us right now.
Thank you.
If we could have got more people to understand shared and adaptive sovereignty, maybe we could have avoided the whole Brexit thing. Anyway, so I'm going to hand over to Tom at this point.